July 29, 1932, 4:30 in the morning. A thin man in tattered clothing stands in the smoldering ruins of what was, just hours ago, his home. His name is Joe Angelo. He's a World War I veteran, holder of the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism. 14 years earlier, he dragged a wounded officer out of German machine gun fire, saving that man's life. Last night, that same officer led cavalry troops who burned Angelo's camp to the ground. The officer's name was George S. Patton. This is the story of July 28, 1932, the day 3 future American heroes attacked 20,000 of their fellow veterans with tanks, tear gas, and bayonets, a day that changed American politics forever and set the stage for World War II leadership in ways no one could have predicted. To understand how America arrived at this moment, you need to know 3 things. First, World War I veterans weren't given the same kind of support we see today. When they came home in 1918 and 1919, there was no GI Bill, no Veterans Affairs hospitals, no extensive support system. Factory workers who stayed home during the war had earned more money than the soldiers who fought. In 1924, Congress tried to fix this by passing the World War Adjusted Compensation Act, promising each veteran a bonus. $1 for every day served in the United States, $1.25 for each day overseas, up to $625 per man. The catch? They couldn't collect until 1945. Second, when the Great Depression hit in 1929, it devastated these veterans. By 1932, 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. The veterans were promised a total of $3.6 billion, but it was locked away for 13 more years while they lost their homes, their jobs, their dignity. They started calling it the tombstone bonus, because many of them would be dead before they could collect. Third, in May 1932, a former Army sergeant named Walter Waters stood up at a veterans meeting in Portland, Oregon, and said something simple but revolutionary. He said, "Let's go to Washington and ask for our money now, not later, now." By the end of June, more than 20,000 veterans and their families had descended on the nation's capital, creating what would become the largest protest camp in American history. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, echoing their wartime unit. The newspapers called them the Bonus Army. Douglas MacArthur was already a legend by 1932. At 52 years old, he was the youngest Army Chief of Staff in American history. His office in the State War Navy building, just west of the White House, reflected his status. Immaculately dressed, rarely seen without his signature cap, MacArthur carried himself with an air that some called confidence and others called arrogance. He'd been the most decorated American officer in World War I, 22 decorations for valor, 13 times recommended for the Medal of Honor. But MacArthur also believed in order, in hierarchy, in the idea that challenging authority was tantamount to revolution. When he looked at the bonus army camps, he didn't see desperate veterans. He saw something else entirely. In his own words, he believed the camps harbored what he called a revolutionary element, bent on overthrowing the government. He told his staff that pacifism and communism were all around them, that these marches represented a clear and present danger to the republic itself. His young aide, Major Dwight Eisenhower, tried to argue with him, tried to convince him this was a local police matter, that the Army's top officer shouldn't be personally involved. MacArthur dismissed these concerns. This was his moment. This was what leadership looked like. George Patton, meanwhile, was a 36-year-old cavalry major still burning with ambition. He'd made a name for himself in World War I as commander of the Tank Corps, had been wounded in action, and harbored dreams of military glory that seemed increasingly distant in peacetime. Patton was a study in contradictions. He could quote classical literature, loved poetry, wrote detailed tactical analyses of ancient battles. He also believed absolutely in the use of force in decisive action, in never showing weakness. His instructions to his cavalry troops before the operation were chilling. According to historical records, he told them, quote, "If you must fire, do a good job. A few casualties become martyrs, a large number an object lesson. When a mob starts to move, keep it on the run. Use a bayonet to encourage its retreat. If they are running, a few good wounds in the buttocks will encourage them. If they resist, they must be killed," end quote. Patton had another connection to the bonus army that would make the day's events even more painful. Somewhere in those camps was a man named Joe Angelo, a veteran from Camden, New Jersey, and Patton owed him his life. Among the 20,000 veterans camping in Washington was Walter Waters, the former sergeant who'd started it all. Waters had managed an almost impossible feat. He'd kept 20,000 desperate, frustrated men and their families organized and peaceful for nearly 3 months. He'd established camp rules, created a command structure, even formed a military police force to keep order. He'd kept the camps integrated, with black and white veterans living and protesting together, something unprecedented in segregated America. And despite the government's refusal to help, despite the growing frustration, despite the heat and filth of the camps, Waters had maintained discipline. The House of Representatives had passed the Patman Bill on June 15th, 211 to 176. For a moment, hope surged through the camps. But 2 days later, the Senate crushed that hope, defeating the bill 62 to 18. Most veterans went home. About 10,000 stayed, and with them thousands of family members. Children played in the streets between the shacks. Babies cried in the summer heat. These weren't revolutionaries. They were Americans who'd served their country, and now couldn't feed their families. The morning of July 28, 1932, started with a bureaucratic decision that would spiral into catastrophe. President Herbert Hoover, under pressure from Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon and others in his cabinet, ordered the District of Columbia commissioners to clear the veterans from certain federal buildings along Pennsylvania Avenue. These buildings were slated for demolition, and the administration wanted them empty. The police chief, Pelham Glassford, a World War I brigadier general himself, who'd been sympathetic to the veterans, received the order with dread. He'd been supplying the camps with tents, rolling kitchens, even medical supplies. He'd suggested letting the protest die down naturally, as summer heat drove people home, but now he had direct orders. At 10:30 that morning, Glassford's police began moving into the buildings to evict the veterans. What happened next depends on whose account you believe, but the outcome was undeniable. A scuffle broke out. Bricks and stones flew. A police officer named George Chenot drew his revolver. 2 shots rang out. William Hushka, a 37-year-old veteran from Chicago, an immigrant from Lithuania, who'd sold his butcher shop to enlist in 1917, fell with a bullet wound. He would die hours later. Eric Carlson, a 38-year-old veteran from Oakland who'd fought in the trenches of France, was also shot. He too would later die from his wounds. The camps exploded in anger and confusion. What had been an orderly protest suddenly teetered on the edge of chaos. By noon, the situation had deteriorated beyond Glassford's control. The police had fallen back. Veterans, enraged by the deaths of 2 of their own, were throwing debris, threatening to storm government buildings. The district commissioners sent an urgent message to the White House. They needed federal troops. Hoover consulted with Secretary of War Patrick Hurley. The decision was made: call in the army. The order went to Douglas MacArthur at 1:45 that afternoon. Clear the veterans from federal property. Restore order. Use whatever force is necessary. MacArthur had been waiting for this moment. He later claimed he'd been planning for this contingency for weeks, certain that the camps harbored communist agitators who would eventually attempt an insurrection. He assembled his forces with military precision. 600 troops from the 3rd Cavalry and the 12th Infantry. 6 Renault tanks, relics from World War I but still imposing and terrifying. Machine gun units, supplies of tear gas grenades. Major Dwight Eisenhower, MacArthur's aide, made one last attempt to change his chief's mind. According to Eisenhower's later writings, he told MacArthur that this was a mistake, that the Army's top officer shouldn't be seen personally leading troops against American citizens, that this would look like the military crushing free speech and the right to petition. MacArthur's response, according to multiple accounts, was dismissive. He was too busy to be bothered by people coming down and pretending to bring orders. He put on his dress uniform, complete with medals and riding crop, and prepared to lead his troops personally. He assigned Major George Patton to command the cavalry. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the Army began its advance down Pennsylvania Avenue. Office workers poured out of buildings to watch. Crowds lined the sidewalks. At first, some of the veterans thought it was a parade, a show of support. They clapped and cheered. Then they saw the soldiers' faces, grim and focused. They saw the gas masks being donned. They saw the bayonets being fixed. The infantry advanced in 2 waves, throwing tear gas grenades ahead of them. Thick grey clouds of stinging gas rolled through the camps. Veterans who'd survived German gas attacks in France now choked on American gas in their own capital. Women grabbed their children and ran. The elderly stumbled, blinded by tears. Patton's cavalry moved in next, sabers drawn, horses stepping in precise formation. According to Patton's own account, written in a letter days later, he and his men charged at a gallop at one group of veterans in a truck. He wrote, quote, "We had some nice work at close range with the occupants of the truck, most of whom could not sit down for some days," end quote. He'd struck American veterans with the flat of his sword. By 7 o'clock that evening, the camps along Pennsylvania Avenue had been cleared and set on fire. Flames lit up the summer sky, visible for miles. The Capitol dome stood in silhouette against the orange glow. Newsreel cameras captured everything. But the operation wasn't over. The main camp, where most of the 20,000 veterans and their families lived, sat across the Anacostia River on the muddy flats beyond. President Hoover, watching reports come in, sent a messenger to MacArthur with explicit orders. Do not cross the bridge into Anacostia. Stop the operation at the river. Let the veterans disperse on their own from the main camp. The order reached MacArthur around 7:30. He ignored it. He later claimed he never received it, or that he was too busy to be bothered with messengers. Eisenhower, standing beside him, knew the truth. MacArthur had received the order and chose to disobey. He ordered his troops across the bridge. By 9 o'clock, soldiers were moving through the Anacostia camp with torches. The shantytown, home to thousands of families, went up in flames. Veterans and their wives grabbed what they could carry. Babies screamed. Children cried out in fear and confusion. The camps that had stood for 3 months, that had been a symbol of both desperation and American democracy, burned through the night. The question that haunted everyone who witnessed July 28th was simple. Why? Why did MacArthur disobey a direct order from the President of the United States? Why did Patton strike veterans with his sword? Why did any of this have to happen? To understand the decisions made that day, you have to understand what these men believed they were facing. MacArthur genuinely convinced himself that the bonus army represented an existential threat to American democracy. He'd read intelligence reports, compiled by Army officers and FBI agents, claiming that communist agitators had infiltrated the camps. Some of these reports were accurate. There were communists among the 20,000 men. There were also socialists, anarchists, Republicans, Democrats, and everything in between. But the vast majority were simply desperate veterans who wanted what they'd been promised. MacArthur, however, saw patterns where there might have been none, connections that existed more in his imagination than in reality. He believed, or convinced himself to believe, that allowing the bonus army to remain would embolden revolutionary elements across the country. He saw himself not as attacking veterans, but as saving the Republic from insurrection. Patton's motivations were more straightforward, but perhaps more troubling. He believed absolutely in the military chain of command, in following orders without question, in using overwhelming force to establish control. When ordered to clear the camps, he executed those orders with enthusiasm. But there was also something else at play. Patton feared weakness, feared any appearance of hesitation or sentiment, and somewhere in those camps was Joe Angelo. On September 26, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in France, Lieutenant Colonel George S. Patton had been leading his tank brigade forward. When German machine guns opened fire, Patton was hit, the bullet tearing into his thigh, severing an artery. He collapsed in the open, bleeding, exposed to continuous fire. His orderly, Private First Class Joe Angelo didn't hesitate. Angelo dragged Patton into a shell hole, dressed his wounds under fire, and stayed with him for over an hour, while shells exploded around them. Angelo carried messages to passing tanks twice, risking his life each time. Then he stayed with Patton until medical help arrived. For this action, Angelo received the Distinguished Service Cross. Patton later told newspapers that Angelo was, quote, "without doubt the bravest man in the American Army. I have never seen his equal," end quote. Patton's mother sent Angelo a watch and a letter of thanks. The Patton family gave him money, set him up in business multiple times over the years, but now, 14 years later, Angelo was unemployed, broke, living in the Bonus Army camps. On the morning of July 29th, after the camps had been burned, Angelo approached his former commander. Patton was having coffee with other officers, discussing the previous night's operation. Angelo, thin and haggard, stepped forward. The moment froze, other officers fell silent. Patton looked at Angelo for a long moment. Then, according to multiple witnesses and confirmed by a New York Times article, published the next day, Patton said, quote, "I do not know this man. Take him away and under no circumstances. Permit him to return," end quote. Angelo was escorted out. After he left, according to Paul Dixon and Thomas B. Allen's definitive book on the Bonus Army, Patton explained to his fellow officers. He said, quote, "That man was my orderly during the war. When I was wounded, he dragged me from a shell hole under fire. I got him a decoration for it. Since the war, my mother and I have more than supported him. We have given him money. We have set him up in business several times. Can you imagine the headlines if the papers got word of our meeting here this morning?" End quote. Patton's decision was calculated. He chose his reputation, his career, his image, over acknowledging the man who'd saved his life. The next day, the New York Times ran the story anyway, under the headline, quote, "A cavalry major evicts veteran who saved his life in battle," end quote. Herbert Hoover's decision to call in the army was driven by different fears. He was 6 months away from a presidential election. He was already losing badly. The Depression had destroyed his presidency. Unemployment was 25%. Banks were failing. Homes were being foreclosed. Hooverville's shantytowns, named mockingly after the president, had sprung up across the country. The last thing Hoover needed was newsreel footage of desperate veterans being beaten by police in the nation's capital. He wanted the problem gone, quietly, efficiently, with minimal violence. But Hoover made a fatal error in judgment. He trusted MacArthur to follow orders, to show restraint, to understand the political implications of using military force against veterans. Instead, MacArthur saw an opportunity for glory, for decisive action, for crushing what he perceived as a revolutionary threat. When MacArthur ignored Hoover's order to stop at the Anacostia River, he sealed Hoover's political fate. The images that flooded newspapers and newsreels the next day showed everything Hoover had feared and worse. American soldiers attacking American veterans, cavalry charging families with children, tanks rolling through camps, buildings and shanties in flames. One newsreel narrator intoned, quote, "It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865. They are being forced out of their shacks by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States." End quote. Dwight Eisenhower, the one officer who tried to stop the madness, found himself in an impossible position. As MacArthur's aide, he had to follow his superior, had to be present for the operation, even though he opposed it. Years later, in his memoirs, Eisenhower would claim he'd tried repeatedly to dissuade MacArthur, that he'd advised against the Army's involvement, that he'd warned against crossing the bridge into Anacostia. At the time, however, he kept his objections private, maintained his military bearing, and did his duty. Eisenhower's caution, his reluctance to make a public stand against his superior, would serve him well. While MacArthur's reputation was permanently stained by the Bonus Army incident, Eisenhower largely escaped blame. He'd been present, but not prominently so. He'd objected, but privately. When movie theaters showed newsreels of the attack, and audiences booed and jeered, they booed MacArthur and Patton, not Eisenhower. This ability to position himself carefully, to maintain personal integrity while navigating impossible situations, would serve Eisenhower throughout his career and eventually carry him to the presidency. The decision that mattered most, though, was the collective decision of the American people, watching these events unfold. When they saw soldiers attacking veterans, when they saw families fleeing tear gas, when they saw camps burning with the Capitol dome in the background, they made a decision. They decided that Herbert Hoover had failed them completely, that his government had no compassion, no understanding of their suffering. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic nominee, was already leading in polls. When Roosevelt heard about the Bonus Army attack, he reportedly turned to an advisor and said, quote, "Well, this elects me," end quote. He was right. The Bonus Army incident became the final emblematic failure of the Hoover presidency. The operation to clear the Bonus Army camps took less than 5 hours. But those 5 hours changed American history. At precisely 4:30 p.m. on July 28th, the infantry began their advance. The soldiers, many of them barely older than the camp's children, marched in perfect formation. They'd been ordered to maintain discipline, to use only necessary force, but the definition of necessary was left deliberately vague. The tear gas hit first. CS gas grenades, the same type used in World War I, arced through the air and exploded with dull pops. Within seconds, thick grey clouds rolled through the camps. The gas burned eyes, throats, lungs. People who'd been sitting in the shade suddenly couldn't breathe, couldn't see. Mothers screamed for their children. Veterans who'd survived the trenches found themselves choking on American gas in their own capital. The panic was immediate and total. Some veterans tried to stand their ground, hurling bricks and debris at the advancing soldiers, but the gas was overwhelming. Others grabbed whatever possessions they could carry and fled. Families poured out of their shacks, many leaving everything behind: books, clothes, keepsakes, photographs, all abandoned in the rush to escape the gas. Behind the infantry came Patton's cavalry, and this is where the operation shifted. From crowd control to something darker. Patton led his men personally, mounted on a large horse, saber drawn. The cavalry advanced at a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop in some cases. The sound of horses' hooves thundering down Pennsylvania Avenue mixed with the crack of breaking wood as shacks were torn down. Veterans scattered before the mounted troops, but some stood and fought. Patton later described one encounter with particular satisfaction. A truck full of veterans was throwing debris at the cavalry. Patton and another officer charged the truck at full gallop. According to Patton's own account, they had, quote, some nice work at close range, striking the occupants with the flats of their sabers. The men in the truck, Patton wrote, couldn't sit down for days. These weren't enemy soldiers. They weren't foreign combatants. They were American veterans, men who'd fought in the same war Patton had fought in, men who'd faced the same enemies, endured the same hardships, and Patton struck them with his sword. The tanks came last. 6 Renault FT light tanks, obsolete by modern standards, but terrifying to anyone who'd never seen one up close. The tanks didn't fire their weapons, but they didn't need to. Their mere presence, grinding down Pennsylvania Avenue, crushing debris, knocking down barriers, sent a clear message. This was military force, overwhelming and unstoppable. By 6:30 p.m., the camps along Pennsylvania Avenue were cleared. Soldiers began systematically burning the shacks. The fire spread quickly. Tar paper and scrap wood burned hot and fast. Within an hour, the entire area was ablaze. The smoke could be seen from miles away. Office workers who'd stayed late watched from their windows. Congressmen looked out from the Capitol steps. The whole city was witnessing what was happening. At 7 p.m., with the Pennsylvania Avenue camp still burning, President Hoover sent his explicit order to MacArthur. The immediate threat is over. Do not cross the bridge into Anacostia. Allow the main camp to disperse on its own. Let people gather their belongings and leave peacefully. This was Hoover's attempt to salvage something, to at least show that once order was restored, the government would show some restraint, some mercy. MacArthur received the order. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. Eisenhower was standing next to him when the messenger arrived. MacArthur read the order, looked at the bridge leading to Anacostia, and made his decision. He would finish the job completely. He ordered his troops to advance. Eisenhower, according to his later accounts, tried one more time to change MacArthur's mind. He pointed out that they'd accomplished their mission, that the president had given explicit orders to stop, that crossing the bridge would be seen as excessive force. MacArthur's response, reconstructed from multiple sources, was essentially that he knew better than civilians what needed to be done, that he couldn't be bothered with political considerations when order was at stake. At 7:45 p.m., the army crossed the Anacostia River Bridge. The main camp, home to the majority of the bonus army families, sprawled across the muddy flats, in a warren of shacks, tents, and makeshift shelters. People had been living here for months. They'd created a community. Children played between the shacks. Women had set up cooking areas. Men had organized work details to maintain sanitation, dig latrines, collect garbage. This was where Joe Angelo had been living, along with thousands of others. The assault on Anacostia was more systematic than the Pennsylvania Avenue clearing. The soldiers moved in waves, using tear gas to drive people out of the camps, then setting fire to empty structures, Some veterans tried to resist. They threw stones, brandished clubs, shouted defiance. But they were unarmed and disorganized, and the military advance was relentless. By 8:30 p.m., the first shacks were burning. The fire spread rapidly through the densely packed camp. Within an hour, the entire Anacostia camp was ablaze. Families fled in every direction, crossing the river, heading into Maryland, Virginia, anywhere away from the flames and gas. Some veterans had cars and trucks, and these became overloaded with people and possessions. Others walked, carrying children, dragging suitcases, stumbling through the darkness. The scene was chaos. Crying children, shouting men, women calling out for family members. And through it all, the soldiers maintained their formation, completing their mission, following MacArthur's orders to clear the camps completely. By midnight, it was over. The camps were gone, reduced to smoldering ruins. The bonus army had been dispersed by force. 20,000 people, veterans and families, had been driven from the nation's capital by the United States Army. One more scene from that night deserves recording. As the camps burned and families fled, cameramen from newsreel companies captured everything. The footage would play in movie theaters across America within days. In one scene, captured by multiple cameras, an older veteran carrying an American flag stumbles through tear gas, coughing, half-blind but refusing to drop the flag. In another, a woman holds a baby wrapped in a blanket, standing amid the ruins of her shack, staring at the camera with an expression that mixed shock, grief, and betrayal. These images, more than any newspaper article or political speech, told the story of July 28, 1932. They showed what happened when the government used military force against its own citizens, against people who'd served their country and simply wanted what they'd been promised. The next morning, Washington woke to a city transformed. Where there had been camps, now there were ruins. Where there had been 20,000 voices demanding justice, now there was silence. The bonus army was gone. The political aftermath of the bonus army incident was swift and brutal for Herbert Hoover. Newspapers across the country ran front-page photos of the burning camps. The Washington Daily News, typically sympathetic to Hoover's Republicans, called it, quote, "a pitiful spectacle to see the mightiest government in the world chasing unarmed men, women and children with army tanks. If the army must be called out to make war on unarmed citizens, this is no longer America," end quote. Movie theaters showed newsreels of the attack, and audiences booed. They booed when MacArthur appeared on screen. They booed when cavalry charged. They booed when the camps burned. The jeering was so loud and so consistent that some theaters stopped showing the footage because it was disrupting other films. Franklin Roosevelt's campaign didn't need to mention the bonus army. The images spoke for themselves. When Americans went to vote in November 1932, they gave Roosevelt a landslide victory. Hoover won just 59 electoral votes to Roosevelt's 472. He carried only 6 states. Roosevelt won by more than 7 million popular votes. Political historians widely agree that the bonus army incident sealed Hoover's fate. It became the symbol of his failure, the visual representation of a government that had lost touch with its people. For MacArthur, Patton, and Eisenhower, the consequences were more complicated. MacArthur's reputation took a significant hit. Biographer William Manchester called his actions that day, quote, "flagrantly insubordinate and indefensible," end quote. Yet Roosevelt, despite his private criticism of the attack, reappointed MacArthur as Army Chief of Staff. MacArthur would go on to command forces in the Pacific during World War II, though his relationship with civilian authority remained troubled throughout his career. His defiance of presidential orders didn't start or end with the bonus army. Patton faced less public criticism than MacArthur, partly because he was less senior and less visible in command. But those who knew the details of his actions that day, particularly his rejection of Joe Angelo, judged him harshly. Patton himself seemed to recognize, at least privately, that something was wrong with what had happened. In letters to his wife, he downplayed his role, emphasized that he'd followed orders, suggested that the press coverage was biased, but he never publicly addressed his encounter with Angelo, never acknowledged the man who'd saved his life. Patton would become one of World War II's most famous generals, but the bonus army remained a stain on his record that no amount of later glory could completely erase. Eisenhower emerged from the incident with his reputation largely intact, precisely because he'd been careful to maintain a low profile and to voice his objections privately rather than publicly. This caution, this ability to navigate politically dangerous situations without becoming a target, would characterize Eisenhower's entire career. By the time he published his memoirs decades later, he portrayed himself as having opposed the operation. From the start, having tried to dissuade MacArthur, having been appalled by the disobedience of presidential orders. Whether this account is entirely accurate or partly self-serving revisionist history, it allowed Eisenhower to separate himself from the incident in the public mind. When he ran for president in 1952, the bonus army was barely mentioned, while MacArthur's role in it remained controversial. For the veterans themselves, the immediate aftermath was devastating. They scattered across the country, returning to the same unemployment and poverty they'd faced before. Some joined the growing number of homeless Americans riding freight trains, looking for work that didn't exist. Others returned to families who'd been hoping the March on Washington would solve their problems. But the bonus army hadn't failed completely. They'd made their case to the American people. And while Congress had rejected them, the public had not. In 1933, when a smaller group of veterans attempted another bonus march, under the new Roosevelt administration, the response was dramatically different. Roosevelt sent his wife, Eleanor, to visit the camps. She ate with the veterans, listened to their stories, sang songs with them. One veteran famously remarked, quote, "Hoover sent the army, Roosevelt sent his wife," end quote. Roosevelt offered the veterans jobs with the Civilian Conservation Corps, and most accepted. The camps dispersed peacefully, but Roosevelt still opposed paying the bonus early. He vetoed legislation to do so multiple times. Finally, in 1936, Congress had had enough. They passed the Adjusted Compensation Payment Act over Roosevelt's veto, authorizing the immediate payment of $2 billion in bonuses. The first checks went out in June 1936. Veterans received an average of $580 each, slightly less than the $625 they would have received in 1945, but 9 years early when the money still mattered. William Huschke and Eric Carlson, the two veterans who died on July 28, 1932, never received their bonuses, but more than 3.6 million other veterans did. The bonus army had won, but it took 4 more years and a different president to admit it. The longer legacy of the bonus army incident is even more profound. It established precedents about how the government treats veterans, about the limits of military force against civilians, about the relationship between the people and their government. When World War II veterans came home in 1945, Congress remembered the bonus army. They remembered what happened when you make promises to soldiers and then break those promises. They passed the GI Bill, which provided education, home loans, business loans, and other benefits immediately, not deferred for decades. The GI Bill transformed American society, creating the middle class, enabling millions to go to college, buy homes, start businesses. It's widely considered one of the most successful pieces of social legislation in American history, and it exists, at least in part, because of what happened on July 28, 1932. There's a question that hangs over the events of July 28, 1932. What if MacArthur had followed orders? What if he'd stopped at the Anacostia River, allowed the main camp to disperse peacefully? What if Patton had acknowledged Joe Angelo, had shown mercy to the man who'd saved his life? What if Hoover had found a different solution, worked with Congress to provide at least some relief, treated the veterans as citizens rather than threats? History pivots on these moments of decision, these choices between compassion and force, between humanity and expedience. The bonus army incident shows us something uncomfortable about ourselves and our institutions. It shows us that even democracies can turn violent against their own citizens when those citizens become inconvenient. It shows us that even heroes can make terrible choices when they prioritize order over justice, reputation over integrity. It shows us that the most decorated generals, the most experienced commanders, can lose sight of the humanity of the people they're ordered to control. But it also shows us something else. It shows us that people can endure, can organize, can maintain dignity even in desperate circumstances. Walter Waters kept 20,000 frustrated men peaceful for 3 months. The bonus army camps were integrated, cooperative, orderly. Veterans who'd been told they were worthless proved they still had discipline, still had purpose. And ultimately, they won. Not immediately, not easily, but they won. We like to think that the bonus army couldn't happen today, that we've learned something, that we treat our veterans better now, and in many ways we do. But the fundamental tension remains. What do we owe the people who serve their country? What happens when governments make promises and then claim they can't afford to keep them? What's the balance between fiscal responsibility and moral obligation? These questions didn't die on the Anacostia Flats in 1932. They're still with us, still unresolved, still requiring each generation to find their own answers. The story of the bonus army connects directly to many of the challenges veterans face today, from healthcare access to benefits processing, to the fundamental question of how we honor service. If you're interested in exploring more stories about decisive moments in American military history, check out our video on the Battle of the Bulge and Patton's impossible relief of Bastogne, where that same George Patton made decisions that saved thousands of lives, rather than driving them from their homes. Understanding these historical moments helps us make better decisions in the present. If you found this story valuable, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. Share this video with anyone interested in American history, military history, or the ongoing conversation about how we treat our veterans. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and who we want to become. Thank you for watching.